There are so many different types of reverb to choose from, it can be pretty confusing. You know, when is a plate reverb a better choice than a regular room reverb? What is a good musical situation for using modulated reverb? What is dynamic reverb and why would you want to use that? You know, these are the kind of questions I had for a long time anyway. So while obviously there's no hard rules with any of this, I just thought I'd do this video to show how I choose between different reverb types, how they've kind of been used historically in classic recordings, and just have some fun with the cool sounds you can get from making your guitar sound like it's in a particular space. I'm going to use the Boss RV6 only because it's a pretty standard bit of kit. All this stuff is relevant to any reverb pedal that has these same modes available. I'm going to be talking about reverb types in a really broad sense, so it's not at all specific to the RV6. I'll start with basic room reverb, and let's just split that into two categories, you know, small room and large room. And to get the sound of a small room, I'll just turn the time control down a bit. And with small room, I like to turn the effects level up quite high, so it's actually quite in your face, that reverb sound. It can sound kind of odd and harsh for more general type playing. You know, you might be thinking my guitar just sounds like it's in a bathroom or something. You know, it's not an immediately pleasant sound, but this small, short reverb can give drive sounds, and particularly lead guitar solo sounds, a lot of attitude and character. It doesn't suffer from sounding washy like longer reverbs do, and if anything, it actually brings you more to the front of the mix, which is exactly what you want for a lead guitar sound. I notice it a lot in like a lot of rock and grunge recordings. Serve All the Servants by Nirvana, there's a guitar solo in Out of the Way by the Vines. You know, it's stuff like that I think it's really good for. If you want to get a more regular room reverb, like one to use at home for practicing to make your small practice room sound a bit bigger and more like a professional studio room or something like that, then turn the time control up a bit so it sounds like a bigger room, and then turn the effects level down a touch so it's not too washy and over the top. It's about that balance of having it sound like a big room so your guitar sounds nice and big and satisfying to play in your small practice room, but not so over the top that it sounds like completely fake and unnatural. For me, this is one that works best in the practice room. At gigs, I find I'm already in a big room anyway, so my guitar just doesn't really need it. It's more one that I use at home for practicing. Unlike room reverbs, where I think they can be small or large, hall reverbs, I always think of a large space. So I've set the time control pretty high for this hall reverb. And the most distinctive thing for me about big hall reverbs compared to other big reverbs is that it's still a fairly natural sound. You know, it's that familiar sound of a school hall or a church or something like that. I really like big hall reverbs the most for when I'm playing slower pieces on my own, or if there's a section of a song where I'm playing more on my own and there's space for that big reverb to be heard. With busier mixes where they're maybe faster paced and more upbeat, I find it makes the guitar just sound too distant, you know. But for more melancholy, slower tunes, it can be a really natural, beautiful sound. Spring reverb is a relatively bright and clear sounding vintage reverb that you find in a lot of amps. It literally comes from a box with springs in, a spring tank, and you can tell if you've got a real spring tank in your amp by just giving it a knock, and if it's a real spring tank you'll hear a crash. And like I said, it's fairly bright vintage reverb sound, and it has a distinctive drip to it as well, which I think is coming from the like bright rattle of the springs in the spring tank. I associate it most with like 60s surf rock guitar and stuff like that, so players like Dick Dale and Hank Marvin, but it's natural sounding enough to use as a more versatile general purpose reverb as well. Plate reverb, which is basically just a very large box with a sheet of metal suspended inside of it, for me is like the studio equivalent of spring reverb. It's a vintage studio reverb, and it's more natural sounding than spring reverb, but it has more of a distinctive colour and character to it than something like a modern digital hall reverb or something like that. Plate reverb really helped mould the sound of vintage recordings, particularly from the 60s and 70s. So, you know, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, to Pink Floyd, all the jazz recordings that came out of the Rudy Van Gelder studio, all that stuff is sprinkled with the sound of plate reverb. It's a fairly natural and versatile reverb with quite a fast response and a distinctive like light flutter and modulation to the sound as well, which I think comes from the plate physically wobbling. See if you can hear it in this emulation of it, and in general it's a versatile vintage studio reverb. Modulated reverb is what I use if I want quite a modern sounding reverb. You know, it's not very natural sounding. It has a heavily processed, almost artificial sound to it. It kind of sounds futuristic. You know, it's really good if you want a kind of spacey synth type flavor to your reverb. With short modulated reverb, it has a pretty similar sound to if you're using a reverb pedal and a chorus pedal together at the same time. You know, that chorus effect comes through pretty clearly as you play, and it has that kind of slightly 80s sound to it. When you use longer reverb times, that's when you get this more modern, spacey sort of sound, and you can hear that the chorus modulation is more attached to the reverb signal than the main guitar sound. Really good for modern indie stuff, Radiohead, things like that. The plus delay setting on the RV6 does exactly what you'd expect it to do. It adds a delay effect to the reverb effect, so you've got both of those effects happening at the same time. Loads you can do with this, and if you're interested in like stacking time-based effects like this, then I've got some other videos on that you might want to check out too. You are a bit limited by not having control over the delay and the reverb settings individually, but it's a nice way to get into stacked delay and reverb sounds in one pedal. Set the time control high and do some volume swells for some basic ambient guitar sounds. could lean into the delay element as well and play with it more rhythmically, which you can't really do with reverb alone. Or if you don't use delay very often, then this setting might get you through without the need for a dedicated delay pedal on your board. It works well as a short delay, and the added reverb gives it a fairly distinct flavour. Shimmer is one of the more recent trends in reverbs, where it adds an octave up to the reverb sound. It's pretty unique, and depending on what you play, it can sound, shimmery or organ-like, or just, generally ethereal. See what you think. If you like big spacey reverbs but you want to try and keep some clarity and definition to what you're actually playing, then dynamic reverb is worth checking out. It adds a type of ducking compressor that only activates when you play hard. So when there's a gap in the music, or if you're just playing very lightly, then you'll hear that nice big reverb sound. When you start to dig in and play much harder, that's when the volume of the reverb drops, and you can hear that clarity and definition in what you're actually playing again. This one on the RV6 has modulation on it, which doesn't sound too out of place to me. Dynamic reverb isn't the most natural sounding reverb anyway, so having a bit of extra processing on it sounds quite nice to me. Listen to the way that it reacts to my playing, and it kind of develops throughout a piece with your playing. See if you can hear what I mean.